introduce Sally Dodge. She's been in the area for a very long time. We all know and love Sally. Sally, among many of her accomplishments, is the Northeast Community Development Manager and board member of managers at Iroquois Valley Farms, LLC, which is an investment firm that invests in farms, local farms. They're very interesting. Look them up on the web. She's been instrumental in promoting small, diversified farms in Vermont. She helped to link small farmers and restaurants through direct farm sales, through farmers markets and CSAs. She manages a family farm in Pownell. She encourages organic farming, local foods. She's been on the board of the Vermont Land Trust, and she's on the board of the Cleveland Dodge Foundation, owner of the Mountain Goat and Vermont Lamb Company, and an organic sheep operation. Sally's going to talk to us today about regenerative agriculture. And Sally, to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. Thank you to the Bennington Garden Club and the One World Center for providing this opportunity to talk to you about, maybe you heard it in Patsy's introduction, I'm passionate about farms, farming, and soil. And now my big passion is climate change. We've got to slow it down. I want to also thank my husband, Dale Gobranton, who is always helping me think things through and write them down and deliver them. So thank you, Dale. I'm also really happy that Judy Schwartz is here. She's been an inspiration to me through her book, Cows Save the Planet. And I'll talk more about that, but it's been just a wonderful thing since Judy and I met, and she's hooked me up with a lot of soil and climate scientists through Soil for Climate, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I regret that Jesse's not here, but we're celebrating his brand new baby, Isabel, who was born at 3:45 this morning. And he said he had gone for 29 hours with no sleep. This was a, whoops, I'm doing the wrong one here. This was a picture we took for Soil for Climate, which is a wonderful group of scientists and other people who are interested in soils. I suggest that anybody who is interested, you can either get to Soil for Climate, which doesn't usually say climate, Soil for Climate on Facebook, and then there's also a wonderful Soil for Climate website, and soilforclimate.org and /resources, because the resources there are wonderful, and there are a great many terrific videos about soil management and climate change. So this is Jess's farm in Shaftesbury. I hope it's not all the time. Jesse's farm in Shaftesbury, called the Pullman Farm. You might have known Edie Devon, who had a large horse farm over there on Trumbull Hill Road for quite a number of years. Edie unfortunately died of a brain tumor about, I think in 2012. This was a farm of Edie's family, and Callie was, Jesse's wife, was and she didn't inherit the whole farm, but she inherited the use of the farm, and she will inherit the farm. Her parents are still alive. Anyway, they came in 2012 to run the farm. They had both been working at other things. They're quite young. They're in their early 30s, and wanted to get involved with farming and soil regeneration. I'm just looking at my notes here. So this is the farm that I farmed from 1975 to 1986, and I grew up just up the road from that in the neighboring farm, and these two farms now belong to my family still, and I manage them, and I lease the farms to Lisa McDougall, who has Mighty Food Farm, a CSA, wonderful vegetable CSA, and then I also lease to the Gardner family that owns Hilltop Farm and their organic dairy farmers. And Crystal Gardner and I, she's one of the young family members, we bought a flock of sheep in about 2012. And we ran the sheep on this farm, but we ran into some big problems with parasites with the sheep. And so last year, we decided that we didn't want to run them on that ground for a while, so we brought the sheep over to Jesse's and partnered with him, and so that's how the sheep ended up in Shaftesbury. You'll hear a lot more about the sheep. Because the sheep are the basis for our regenerative farming activities. This is Jesse's farm, which they call Studio Hill Farm. So originally he set it up, this would be in 2013, for chickens. And he was going to just pasture the chickens. I think mostly that also had to do with the fact that that's what he could afford when he went on the farm. And you can see these fields. Edie Devon raised a lot of hay for her horses. And she felt that it was really important to put fertilizer on the fields and then to rotate the hay with corn. Every 4 years, she'd rotate to 2 years of corn. So that meant she plowed it up, sprayed the Roundup, planted the hay seed, and it was usually a pretty fancy monoculture or maybe a couple of kinds of grass, but not much in there, not much diversity, because her fancy horse customers wanted a certain kind of hay. And then they would go through that routine, fertilizing with synthetic fertilizer every year, and then then plant it back in hay, plowing it up and using the Roundup the next time around. Jesse decided he didn't want to have anything to do with that, so he just stopped. And the yield of the hay fields went down dramatically in the first 2 years. And the third year it was beginning to come back. But then last year in late May, early June, we introduced the sheep onto Jesse's farm. And he put them right onto the hay fields, these same fields here. And because there were 60 sheep, we could move them, mob graze them. You put them in an electric flexi-net fence and just move the fence every day. And the sheep don't eat right down to the ground, because that's not what you want. You want them to eat the top third of the grasses, which is the sweetest part of the grass, and then you move them. And so while they're in there and they're eating that, they trample what they don't eat. They leave manure and urine on the ground. And because they haven't eaten all the way down, the root structure of those grasses go in much, much deeper and remain deeper. And they're able to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and hold it in the ground. And because they only eat the top third of those grasses, the flavor of the meat is so much better. It's just amazing to taste the difference between animals that have grazed lightly on pasture and then moved along. I'm going to talk in a little bit about Alan Savory, but the mob grazing, holistic herd management idea is that in the wild, animals, particularly bison and deer and antelope in Africa or whatever, they're all moved by wolves, and they don't stay in any place for any particular time. And so as they moved through, they kept the grasslands healthy, and they kept the soil fully saturated with carbon. We'll talk a little bit more about that. More pictures of the regenerative farming. So this is where he had his chicken tractor the first year. He just moved it. He didn't have enough chickens to do the whole field, but he just moved it in one line for one season, and that's the difference in how the hay looked from one to the other. This is a picture of the ground. When we looked at the ground in 2013, there was a lot of bare spots, bare areas. In 2014, there had been some grasses that had come up and then I think in this picture dug back a little bit, and then in 2015, I couldn't fit the whole thing in there, but it was definitely beautiful green grass coming up after the sheep. And now Jesse's also moving pigs around on there too. So the effect of having a lot of different kinds of animals is that they go through and they'll clean up after each other, and so they get rid of parasites. And we solved the parasite problem of my sheep. They never had any. I mean, we had a little bit of worms, but really not anything to speak of after that. And none died. They had died a lot before. Okay, so now we have to relate our farming practices to climate change and to the state of our food situation and our farming situation in not only in America but in the world. The world has used half the topsoil. Much of the topsoil here goes right to the ocean in one place or another. Ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, an awful lot of it. We've used up half the world's oil. Half the rainforests have been cut down. A third of natural gas and a third of coal has been dug up. And these extractive resource businesses have only in 100 or 150 years just really pushed the degradation of the planet and moved the carbon that was in all of these things up into the atmosphere. So climate change has to do with moving carbon to a place where it used to be, to a place where we don't want it to be, but that's where it is. So then we got to work really hard to move it all back. And some of the scientists, including Judy interviews and visits these people in her book, Cows Save the Planet, and also in lots of things she writes. These scientists are saying, yes, we could sequester all the carbon that is sent up into the atmosphere each year through farming practices, and that's 50% of the carbon emissions. Most people think of carbon emissions as coming totally out of the tailpipes of our cars or out of power plants, but 50% of those emissions are going straight into the air from farming practices. So if we changed our farming practices, and that's a big ticket item because we're up against big industrial farming that has now become, pretty well entrenched, and people are sort of afraid to even, mention it to people, but that's what we're up against. And we could change our farming practices worldwide, and it would be better for the environment and better for people and health and community. Healthy soil. Healthy soil can retain moisture, cool the ground, and cool the air. I've seen some examples of these scientists putting a little thermometer on the ground in a bare spot versus on the ground in a well-covered spot. And the difference is huge. I mean, like on a bare spot, it could be between 108 and 140 degrees right on the ground where it's bare, and where there's plants, it could be in the 70s or 80s on a hot day. Healthy soil will store carbon for fertility. How much of this is new to you? Are you hearing things you haven't heard before? Should I go further into storing for fertility?
I think, yeah.
Okay. Well, I've got a slide on photosynthesis, so we'll go to that one. But anyway, with healthy soils, we can grow healthy food. We do not have healthy food in this country anymore unless we go to the farmer's market or buy from our local farmers. The food that's in the grocery store has been treated with toxins and all kinds of herbicides and pesticides, and added high fructose corn syrup and all the kinds of things that we shouldn't be eating. And we need to get back to growing healthy food. And that's done through healthy soils. And then the biodiversity is just wonderful. This is a picture of the grasses after the sheep had been on there for a year. And you don't plant anything, just beautiful, wonderful, different kinds of plants come up in those grasses. And it's just an amazing thing how that happens. I think a lot of it is that seeds are in the ground, and as the animals go over them, they sort of push the seeds into the ground, and then they move on, and then the rain comes and those seeds will grow in. And then fostering community, we all really, really need to focus on what a difference family farms make from big industrial farms. They tell us that the big industrial farms are going to feed the world, but in fact they're not feeding the world. They're feeding the industrial meat corporations, and they're feeding the high fructose corn syrup and ethanol businesses, but it's a closed loop. Industrial farming is a closed loop of corn and soybeans. Dale and I took an interesting trip out to the Midwest last summer to look at the farms, and it's just, corn and soybeans. And even with our company, Iroquois Valley Farms, that buys farms for organic farmers, a lot of them are just feeding the organic milk industry with organic corn. And it's not the same as real food for real people. And the family farms are so important to all the big problems that we could alleviate: poverty and and ill health and all that. More on the big machines. So since the 1950s, we've created this amazing excavating machinery that can go through these huge, 3, 4, 5,000 acre farms and just tear them up and plant and plow. But every time the land is turned over, all the substructures that have built up, and those are built up by soil microbes, fungi, worms, all of that stuff gets thrown up, and it's like an architecture that was built by these small microorganisms is broken, and it has to start all over again. So it's as though somebody came in and ripped out all our cities. It would be sort of like looking at Syria today, maybe, to what the farm machinery does to our soils. And so the carbon goes up into the air, and it doesn't come back until more seeds are planted, and that's fine and the carbon emissions do go down in the summer when the fields are planted with corn and soybeans or whatever, but then the minute they turn that over, it all goes back up in there. So that's what regenerative farming really is okay, how are we going to grow these crops, grow what we need to eat, and not till the soil over? So we've got a system now called no-till farming, and I have to say that the Department of Agriculture has a really great part of the department called the NRCS, which is the Natural Resource and Conservation Service. And they really understand about soils, and they have put in a really good program to help with soil regeneration. And so they're talking to all farmers, whether they're chemical farmers or organic farmers, about no-till farming. The difference is that the chemical farmers still like to use Roundup to kill whatever weeds might come up, whereas the regenerative farmers are trying to work with whatever plant cover they might plant as a cover crop, or what would come in, and then they crush it with they've got a big machine, it's got a big roller on the front, it crushes the plants that are on the field, and then it comes along with a wheel, a lot of wheels like on a disc harrow, that is really sharp, and it cuts a little tiny furrow, and then it's got a seed drill that drills the seeds in there. And so then the crop comes up, the cover crop has gotten kind of pushed down, and it turns into a thatch on the top of the soil, and that protects the soil like a mulch in your garden, and then the seeds will come up through there. Is that right? And then the other thing is, well, we know that the chemicals in the fertilizer aren't good because they're going to kill the microbes in the soil. And it's amazing to me how all these people in plant and soil science at all the different universities, even at Purdue, until very recently, they didn't think about soil microbes. They thought that dirt was just a medium that you would plant something in, and then you'd add the fertilizer, and the crops would come up. But now we're beginning to understand that dirt is what they use in the Midwest, and soil is what can really sequester the carbon, build up the fertility of the ground, and it needs to stay there. The soil microbes communicate with the fungi, and the fungi, if you've noticed in your garden, there's those little white strands that go places, that's the fungi. And they are communicating with all the other plants and with the soil microbes, and they're creating that architecture that I talked about that builds the soil underneath, and you don't want to disturb that. So in my own garden, and I don't want you to come and look at it because it's a mess, but in my own garden, the scissors now are my favorite tool. And I go, because I was pulling out the beans after they had fruited, and I thought, you know, here's these little rhizomes that come on the beans, you know, those little nitrogen fixers that are on the roots of your beans. And I'm thinking, well, this is violent. I'm pulling out these bean plants, and those rhizomes aren't staying in there to keep the nitrogen in the soil. So I got my scissors, and now I just go through with them. I don't use my diggers at all anymore. And then mulch on top of that. Oh yeah, and then the winter bear. We were out in California last October, and flying home, we had a perfectly beautiful day, and you could see the whole United States, and the amount of bare soil is just unbelievable. They finish for their crops for the season in the fall, and then it's just all bare. And also, we were out in the Sacramento Valley, and you know, we'd had all that news on the news about the almond trees, and you know, the drought, and everything was so terrible, and you know, how many gallons of water per almond and whatever. And we drove through there. There's no cover crops. There's nothing. It was just bare ground, and they would have these big puddles where they had irrigated, and then, you know, that water goes up into the air. There's no tilth really in the soil if they've been using chemicals, and so the water doesn't down in there. There's more of the same. I think I just said all that. Okay, next, now photosynthesis. We love this. I don't know if you can read all those little words, but a lot of people who are moaning about climate change are trying to think up these really wonderful machines that we could build to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back into the ground and filter it and do all of that. Well, we have those machines, and they're called trees and plants. And nature has just provided us with the most perfect way of combating climate change. And yet, nobody really wants to get it done. They'd rather build some big machine, and it would take a lot of energy to build, when we could be planting more and more trees. Well, we've known we can plant trees for picking up the carbon dioxide, but this is really, really the most important thing. And some of these pictures, I was looking for different pictures on the internet and that are clear. But one thing that they don't have enough of is what's going on under here. It says here, sunlight, well, you know, you have the carbon dioxide comes in, the leaves take the carbon dioxide from the air and release the oxygen into the air. The sunlight comes and gives the chlorophyll, chloroplast, it says, energy to make sugar. And that sugar is what goes down, and that's the carbon. Carbon and sugar are pretty close. The same thing, is that right? Mm-hmm. And so it's those sugars that end up in the roots that feed all those little soil microbes. and the fungi. And the soil microbes then are working away, and they're leaving their waste behind them, and they're feeding the plants, and they're dissolving those sugars. And then the roots are the other thing. Then the roots, if we don't disturb the plants, if the plant has long roots, which corn doesn't, but the roots will go down farther and farther, and they start bringing up minerals from the subsoils. And our diet, because we've eaten so much food that does not have deep roots, we're all suffering from a lot of mineral deficiencies. Magnesium is one of them, and that's the reason for a lot of the ills that people have nowadays. Okay, regenerative farming. So this is what a regenerative farm could look like. Everything's green, everything's covered, everything is absorbing tremendous amounts of water. The deeper you go and the more, the less you compact the earth, then the water goes in there, and it's some huge amount of water that's increased by,
Okay,
Judy's just
okay,
written a
all
word.
right. So, okay, this puts it in perspective, that for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, which is mostly carbon, an acre of land can store an additional 20,000 gallons. So that's really significant when you think about how in many agricultural areas the land is so depleted of organic matter.
Exactly right. And carbon.
So your waste, all that water just doesn't get to go into it doesn't stay in the ground.
And that makes the ground hot, and that makes the problem worse, and that's why we're getting these droughts. So I like that picture. I really don't know where it is. It probably is somewhere not in America. So here's some things we could do. Plant cover crops. People are beginning to do that in industrial farming. In organic farming, you have to do that. That's part of your, the way you keep your land healthy as an organic farmer. So that's to bring the carbon down in, bring the nitrogen in, and keep the ground dry and keep the ground covered and keep the water coming in. And then if you can't plant a cover crop, or if you're waiting for it to grow, you can mulch. A lot of farmers now are mulching between the rows with hay or straw if they don't want to put cover crops in there, or plant with those big no-till planting machines that I was describing. Stop using toxic chemicals. I don't know why, as a nation, we're not more outraged by the amount of toxic chemicals in our land, but every single person in the United States now has a significant amount of glyphosate, which is Roundup, in your blood. And babies, it's in the mother's placental fluids, and we should just be so angry. I get it. Then we should stop disturbing the soil, and we should practice no-till without the chemicals. Cut down on the heavy compacting tractors and the machinery. I mean, it's okay to use some, but in the picture we saw with the big tractors there, they just go over it all over and over and over again. And a lot of places they do many crops in one season. And then rotating the cattle through the fields and croplands is what we've been doing with the sheep. And some of the more interesting people who are doing regenerative farming are realizing that the livestock is very important to the success of their operations. And there's a guy out in North Dakota named Gabe Brown, and he was a very conventional farmer, and he looks the part, and he has about 3,000 or 4,000 acres now in North Dakota, and he just started doing the rotational no-till farming. And then he started introducing on a small level some animals, some cattle and stuff, and that just improved the soil so quickly. that now it's a regular part of his crop rotation. And he's actually now doing cover crops with as many as 20 or 30 different kinds of seeds, including radishes and rutabagas and kale and everything else, because they have different root structures and they have different times of the year when they do better, and they feed the animals, and the animals move through, and then it feeds the soil. So Judy introduced me to Alan Savory, who is a farmer from Zimbabwe who started the Alan Savory Institute, and he had been looking after elephants on a refuge in Zimbabwe, and they thought they had too many elephants because they were always getting overgrazed and they just couldn't maintain all those elephants. And so they culled a huge number of elephants, and it broke his heart, and he knew it was the wrong thing to do, but he thought at the time maybe it was the only thing they could do, and it still didn't solve the problem. And then he took a trip to the United States, and he went across the plains, and he realized that we had had millions of buffalo on the plains of America, and that they didn't overgraze, and that the land could support all those millions of buffalo. And he realized it was because the wolves were moving the buffalo along, and they moved every day, and they stayed bunched, and they kept the soil fertile. And so he started this institute to promote that kind of holistic herd management that can take places that were desert, like this. On this side of the fence there were no animals, and it had been, maybe there had been animals before, but they had overgrazed it until it was turned into desert. And then on this side of the fence they put animals in a mob grazing situation and just moved them every day. And within a short period of time, the grasslands came back. And so now there are a lot of groups, and Judy has them in both books, Save the Planet and Water in Plain Sight, describes these different farms where there's a lot of success with recovering desertified areas. So that kind of area is very different from us in Vermont, but we're certainly seeing the same kinds of results, maybe faster in Vermont. It's not the clearest of pictures, but this is a totally desertified place. I think this picture is from Alan Savory's place. They brought in some animals in 2005, and you can see that there are some grasses starting in there. This one, we don't have dates, but this is about 2000, probably 10, and this is probably 2012 or 13. And they've completely rebuilt the grasslands and the water. Then the water comes in, and they get, the streams start filling up with water again. They have ponds. They have biodiversity of all the animals that need the water, and the place comes back. And that's with holistic herd grazing. And so as we think about, well, wouldn't we rather eat grass-fed beef than CAFO beef, than industrial beef coming from those big beef operations? Well, if we put a lot of emphasis on eating beef that's also restoring our grasslands and and bringing the carbon out of the atmosphere, we'd like our beef even better. So I'd say boycott that beef at the grocery store and buy local.
Some of it is grass-fed.
So now we're into the regenerative ag bill, and I'm going to ask Brian to help with this because he was much more on top of it. I mostly just heard about it. Jesse wrote a really nice article in the Huffington Post, and this is some of what he wrote. If we want to live on a planet with a functioning water cycle and carbon cycle and nutrient cycle, we better pay more attention to our soil. And Franklin Roosevelt said, the wealth of our soil, of our country is in our soil. He said that at the time of the Dust Bowl, and he was an enlightened leader who actually did something, and he started the NRCS, the Natural Resources and Conservation Service, and he put a lot of emphasis on building soils and on farming. Well, that was before we had industrial farming. The farms were in the hands of small family farmers in those days. But he was right. The wealth of our country is in our soils. And we've been depleting the soils, and we can see what that depletion has done to, to our health, to our population, to our communities, and to our food. The broken carbon cycle it's not that carbon's coming from somewhere, it is coming from emissions, but it's the same carbon. It just used to be in the soil and in the earth and in the storage of oil and gas and coal, and it's now moving into the atmosphere. There's not enough moving down, it's in the wrong place, and we need to change our land management policies, which is a big ticket item, but I think that lots of people have to start demanding that we do change these practices. So that brought the Regenerative Ag Bill, which Jesse went to Brian to ask him to introduce it into the Senate, and in Vermont, and it would have been, how we have organic certification for NOFA. NOFA certifies organic farmers, but this is the next thing beyond organic, and that is to provide consumers a way to know that their food is helping to store carbon in the ground, in the earth. And so it would just be a little thing on the package that would say that it was certified regenerative agriculture, and there would be a program that went with it and the certification. Is that about right, Brian?
Yeah, you've done a great job. Jesse came to me maybe. I used to keep a horse up where on Pullman, and when Jesse and I would have a lot of these conversations, and I think everybody here will agree, one of the gubernatorial candidates said recently the greatest threats to our planet are still the existence of nuclear weapons and climate change. And there are still a lot of people out there that really, sadly, a lot of folks in political leadership and policy-making leadership do not support the belief or the science behind human beings have created this problem. And so after a lot of conversations, I serve on natural resources and energy that Jesse and I have had around renewable energy, whether it be solar, hydro, which we're doing a lot of in Bennington now, and wind. He came to me with this idea. And honestly, Sally, you've explained it perfectly. It is a certification program. It would be, you would have to meet one of 3 criteria. If you were to meet one of those 3 criteria, then indeed you would be able to have your product certified regenerative. On the most personal of notes, I cannot think of, well, I'll say it this way. The more we can do to curb, if even possible at this point, curb the climate change, we have to do. It is absolutely, at 45 years of age, it depends on the genetics I have. If I'm my father's son, I may live to be 100 and see all these things. If I'm my mother's son, I may not make it through the night. But the reality is, it is something we need to do for the next generation. I mean, we really are in a state right now where we need to create the infrastructure for renewable energy, as well as put together these kinds of programs to help as much as possible address these issues. I don't know if the science says we could put a windmill at everyone's home, and we may not be able to actually make the impact that we need to make. That being said, we have to do it, I believe. It's not unlike somebody said to me recently at the State House. We all know if one person tosses their garbage out the window, it is not going to destroy our landscape. Of course, we're not going to do it because we as citizens believe the ethical thing to do, not unlike taking steps in this direction, are to preserve our landscape, whether it's through protecting our waters, trying to play a role in the impact of climate change, or really destroy our landscape through pollution. So I applaud Jesse. This is Jesse's baby. I mean, in addition to the one that was just born, Jesse has spent an incredible amount of time at the State House. And he really epitomizes what I consider to be an active citizen, or what we want everybody to be. Somebody who believes in something, somebody who contacts their legislator and says, this is something I believe in, will you support it? And he has been working hard. We didn't have success this year, and it'll be interesting. I'm optimistic going forward that we will. One of the dilemmas, and one of the things, and maybe Judy can actually weigh on this, is that's being debated up there, going back to the organic piece, the certification of organic versus the certification of regenerative. And I think people are still trying to pull apart the difference, and how this is really a big difference. So I'm wondering if you might say something about that.
Sure. Okay, so one thing I'll amend that.
Please.
You said that it did not succeed. I would say that it did not fail, that there was tremendous interest in Montpelier about this. And the challenge is in the details, and what kind of program. And that is difficult. And what are the definitions? And what people also in the committee were saying is that there's a little bit of label fatigue. You know, if you have so many labels, well, if it's this and it's not that. So I think what's useful to note is that what we're doing here in Vermont is in a broader, actually international context, that as we speak, there are organizations and some companies that are really rolling up their sleeves and saying, well, how do we define regenerative? And how do we convey this? And what are the vehicles to articulate the practices to the public? And what's exciting about it is that it's partly meat and dairy and vegetables, so food products, but also clothing. And that conversation is moving forward too. So there is this broader context, and people in this movement around the world are very interested in what's happening in Vermont. In California, I think in their state house, something called the Healthy Soils Initiative, something like that, has just passed, which kind of has created a sort of platform for these kinds of conversations to take place. So it's really a very rapidly moving space, and what's happening in Vermont is really a part of it, because Jesse and Brian made this happen and really brought it up to the State House level. And the people that were there in that committee, while they didn't feel that all the mechanisms were there, they haven't forgotten this.
It's brought a lot of people to understand how important this issue really is, people in the State House.
She was up testifying and also contributing, which was terrific.
Yeah, I want to.
Yeah.
And also, the Center for Sustainable Ag at UVM, they also have been, because as a result of this initiative, they've been working more to get their students out into regenerative farming and getting them to understand. Rural Vermont's been a big help. They do really good work helping the small family farmers.
They're terrific. And if I may just add one final thing, we passed the Clean Water Bill last year, and this really, if we could move in this direction, this will only also, as you mentioned, enhance water quality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's the best way to deal with water quality, really, and it wasn't given enough room in that water quality bill, I think. Okay, we are in the middle of the climate crisis, and we forget that. Somehow we all think, oh, well, there is going to be a climate crisis. There's not going to be. There is one right now, and it's getting worse. I mean, we've seen how much rain we get in a rainfall now because the atmosphere is heated up, can hold so much more water, and when it does rain, that water comes down. What did they have? 18, 24 inches in Baton Rouge the other day. You know, they call it 1 in 1,000 storms, except it's happening every year, a couple times a year. So don't underestimate the fact that we are in the middle of climate change. And if we look to what our grandchildren will be experiencing, it's frightening. It's very frightening. And I think that everybody needs to feel the urgency. Bill McKibben felt it was so urgent that he said we should mobilize as though we were in the middle of World War III. In World War II, the whole country mobilized to combat the enemies in that war, and they built the ships and planes, and the women went to work, and the men went to war, and Bill McKibben says we could mobilize if we felt that urgency, and if we had leadership that felt that urgency. Judy wrote a wonderful article saying we don't want to wage war, we want to wage peace with nature, and that's been the big problem. We have not made peace with nature. Nature has the answers. And if we wipe out the human race with global warming, nature is going to be the winner. I mean, she'll do just fine. So we need to feel the urgency, and we need to pull together to address it. So, garden clubs. Who is better equipped in this nation to deal with making our soils healthy? Who understands soils better and is passionate about soils more than the Garden Clubs of America? So I'm going to challenge the Bennington Garden Club to be the leader in pulling together a program for the National Garden Club. So any of you who have a relationship with the Garden Clubs of America, I would say, and those of us who are passionate about this whole thing can get on board with you, but I think that you have an amazing infrastructure of people all over the country who could pull together and start a real movement and put real pressure on our government to save our planet through soil sequestration. And don't underestimate Vermont. It could start right here. We Vermonters are independent. We're ready to step up. We've already proven that we can do a lot of that. And I'd say let's start it right here in Bennington. So any of you who know people in other garden clubs and people in the Garden Clubs of America, let's get on it. Let's get with it. You have, amazing members, and you're all committed and well-connected people who can get things done.
And when we reintroduce this bill, if it's something that's of interest to you, call your legislator.
Yeah.
Your state rep, and your, Dick Sears and I will reintroduce this, and we're the state senators for Bennington County and Wilmington, but there are a lot of state reps in there that would really need to hear from people.
Yeah.
To move this along.
So as we mobilize with your leadership and the leadership of other garden clubs, we can educate people about the soils and climate, advocate, particularly in Washington, but with all of our government people in all of our states, for the earth and our soils. The infrastructure and the communication of these garden clubs just blows me away. I hadn't thought about it at all until I was thinking about this little talk, and I thought, garden clubs, who else? Who better other than land trusts, which I'm working on as well. Social media. The garden clubs could have a social media system that would get the word out really fast to lots of garden clubs and get that educational material out. And then practicing soil regeneration in your own garden. That's it.
Question for you.
Yes, I hope we'll have lots of questions.
You've been talking about, I'll call it farmland, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And regenerating the soil and so on. What goes on in the woods?
the woods is a really good example of what regenerative agriculture or regenerative soil management
We're
is.
missing.
So in the
farm
woods,
animals.
okay, you've got trees,
Yep.
you've got shrubs, you've got leaves. So the leaves come down, they land on the floor of the forest. Nobody disturbs that floor. So all those microbes and those mycorrhizals and stuff, they're down in there, working away. And you don't see woods that are, you know, well, we see woods dying now in California because they don't have enough water, but that's partly because they've cut down so many trees and because the agriculture is so heavy there that the water's just not happening and the rain's not happening and there's not water retention. But for a healthy forest like what we have here, it's all happening the way it's supposed to happen. And if you could think of farmers' fields or your garden as being like the woods, so you've got a heavy mulch, you don't see, you know, in a new forest, depending on the light or whatever, you might see shrubbery coming up, but pretty soon that will die back. And that mulch will keep the floor of the forest, you know, cool and well mulched and, you know, not too much invasive stuff coming in, some, but not too much. And then those roots go down really, really far and spread out. And there's a wonderful article. I'll have to give you some way to, because I've got a lot of resources. Like, so there's a wonderful article where a lady in Canada, a scientist went out and she actually put some kind of a radioactive shot into the trees, and she followed with a Geiger counter where that radioactivity went, and it went right into these mycorrhizae, the fungi that are those white strands that you see, and it went through, and she proved that the trees were actually talking to each other, and the trees favored their own offspring. And so she could follow their conversation. It's an amazing article.
If I could also add to
But
this.
you wanted to make a point about the animals.
Yeah, I mean, we're out there killing the deer and the bear and this, that, and the other thing every year because they'll die of that. At least that's the philosophy. They'll die if we don't thin the herds and so on. But I don't think there's that much.
Well, I think that our ecosystem for those is kind of out of whack. I mean, we don't have many wolves that are chasing animals around. They do out in Yellowstone, and they actually found out that it really did make the elk herd a lot healthier. Because the wolves or the other predators will take the weakest and oldest of the prey, and that just builds up the strengths of the herds. But they also do keep them moving. Yeah.
We also don't have mandatory forestry practices. So no one, in the state of Vermont, we tried to pass a mandatory forestry practice last year, which we could not get the votes for. Meaning, if you are not practicing scientifically in forestry, science-proven forestry practices, there would be repercussions. We could not get that passed. And so I would just, again, encourage people to reach out to legislators. That's a big deal. We've seen it drive through different parts of Maine, New Hampshire, even parts of Vermont, a lot of unhealthy forests. People are logging, and they're logging without the proper knowledge. And without really understanding what they're doing, they are doing very serious damage. We all know one of the biggest pieces of evidence of climate change is Irene. And the lack of, in some areas, some of the areas where forestry practices around rivers were not done properly, we ran into significant problems around stream management. So I would just point that out also as an issue that the state needs to address.
You mean the current use plans that everybody has to file with the state
If you're-
don't dictate exactly what they have to do?
So right now, if you're a logger, you're hiring somebody to go in. That person, current use is a little bit different. Current use, you are actually benefiting in some ways, I presume, tax-wise, if your land is in current use. But if your property is not in current use, if your property is being logged for commercial reasons, you do not need right now. You can be educated about best practices, but you do not have to be required to follow these rules. For you to be able to benefit from current use, yes. But if you're part of a massive logging process, again, commercial, then no.
And
The most serious
and
problems I've
as-
seen actually are in Maine, where they now have said, they have required this, they have mandated it.
I noticed, well, I lived in Switzerland for a little while, and in Switzerland, you have, for every tree you take down, you have to plant 2 trees. And that is in a big logging situation, or it's also if you're building a home and you take down 7 trees on your lot, you're gonna have to plant 14 trees when you're done. And something as simple as that could be helpful to, you know, having more carbon fixing mass in our
And I
company.
guess my next question is, most of us have perennial gardens, and I understand the farming fields and understand the machine going over. What do you do with a perennial bed that has a variety of plants coming up through? Do you put hay mulch on them?
Any
You
kind
end
of
up with
mulch. Even the
weeds?
chips is fine, wood chips is fine. But yeah, keep that ground covered. And the perennial bed is just the best thing because the roots are going way down. Think about your, well, I mean, I guess, I'm thinking about my peonies. They don't go that far, but they are constantly linked up with the soil microbes and all of that. And then different plants have different roots. There's some really great pictures on the internet of roots that people have exposed, and some of them, you know, go down 20, 30, 40 feet. Alfalfa has a 30-foot root if you allow it to grow that long as a perennial. And the Land Institute out in, I think they're in Kansas, they are doing some great work on perennial crops. They have bred a kind of a wheat called kernza that can just stay in the field and grow year after year after year and be harvested like a wheat. Yeah, perennials are great. Just keep them covered.
I just have a comment. You're explaining this whole thing in studying years gone by, the history and geography when you were a kid. Is this not what the settlers used to be doing, what you're asking us to do now? Is that not?
We
Is
were
that
called
not?
sodbusters. Well, the settlers, they had much smaller scale equipment. You know, they'd have a
Right.
horse and a small 1 or 2 bottom plow. And it wasn't like this huge earth-moving equipment that we now have where the tractors are pulling these tremendous amounts of equipment. And the other thing is that our, you know, not to get political, but our whole agricultural policy now is to pay people subsidies to grow the corn and the soybeans. We're not getting a subsidy to raise sheep, and they don't get subsidies for their CSA vegetables, but they're getting plenty of subsidies for corn and soybeans. And then there's crop insurance on top of that. So if the corn is going at $3.65 a bushel, but your yield drops down to $3.25, you pick that up in crop insurance. So you never have to actually lose on your corn crop. And that just encourages more and more land going into crops. And that's one of the big reasons that we're losing the monarch butterflies, is because they're just taking up what used to be, you know, along the roadsides and everything. When we were out in the Midwest, it is one road to the side to the other, and there's nothing on the edges. It looks like everybody's lawn. And you get that feeling like these farmers are just nuts about having their fields be perfectly clean without a weed, in the same way that your neighbor might worry about that with his lawn. It's an amazing sight to see. And so, yeah, I think that the settlers, they had a lot of problems with fertility because they did turn over the ground and they didn't have, you know, a constant renewal of the carbon in their soil. And so fertility was a big problem, really, for the last century. They even say that the Indians had problems with fertility and had to move. There's some people that I met through Judy that are doing a wonderful lady in Zimbabwe, an African woman, who's running a program where they got the whole community together and they all are herding their cattle together to combat the desertification. And then at night, they have these, I think they're made out of fabric, aren't they? These corrals, which they put all the cattle in the corral at night, and then they make a big mess in there, but it's the garden the next, after a couple of nights in the corral, and it increases the fertility of their places. So I think that the settlers did have problems with fertility. Anybody else?
Yeah, I read somewhere that if we were to go to regenerative agriculture, we could sequester an incredible amount of carbon incredibly quickly.
We could. There's a wonderful man in Williamstown. His name is Bill Mumaw. He is a climate scientist, was at Williams College and now is at Tufts. Bill was on the UN committee to write the climate change report that came out that they got the Nobel Peace Prize for. And Bill gave a really great talk in December of 2014 at a soil fertility conference, and he lays it out in a video that you can see that we could turn it around in 10 years. And also, we could sequester the same amount of carbon through agricultural practices that is going into the air on an annual basis. The French Minister of Agriculture, his name is Stéphane Le Foll, he has instituted a policy in France called 4 for 1,000.
He brought it to the Paris Climate Talks, COP21.
Yeah, talk about that.
Yeah, so basically, he's really driven by this understanding of the connection between agriculture and climate change and the opportunities that represents to improve the situation. So 4 per 1,000, I always have trouble with all those zeros.
0.4%.
Right, yeah, 0.4% a year. So nations would sign on to this initiative
to increase the carbon in the soil.
By 0.4% a year. So I
never know what the per thousand is.
Right. But that would
stabilize.
That would equal out what carbon that the agriculture puts out, and then as you go on year by year, because it's increasing every year, then it really starts to get significant. So at this point, I think about between 30 and 35 nations around the world have signed on to this, including our neighbors Mexico and Canada, but not the U.S., which is kind of interesting.
Well, the U.S. Agricultural policy is in the hands of the very, very large corporations. And when we do farm support work here in Vermont, starting farmers markets, helping people get their products to market in one way or another, buying locally, all of that, we are constantly at war with the giant corporations that would just be so happy to have every small farmer put right out of business. And we've done a really good job of it in the Midwest, where they don't have communities anymore, the schools are closed. There aren't even grocery stores there. Most people buy their food at convenience stores or the dollar store. Yeah, a lot of people. So our policy is so driven by our large corporations that everybody's afraid. Have you heard Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump talk about agriculture one single word? Whereas it's all about food. We eat food every single day, and nobody in our political discourse wants to talk about our food and our climate. A little bit of talk on climate.
It sounds like they're ignoring the fact that they're putting fertilizers and all that kind of thing into their soil, which is very expensive, and the regeneration might actually save their bottom line.
It will, but the farmers are really entrenched. They don't like to do something different than what they've always done. We've found in our company, Iroquois Valley Farms, that it's a big step for a farmer to decide to go organic. And in these families that we're buying farms for out in the Midwest, they're usually second, third, or fourth generation farmers, and it's the young guys that are willing to take the risk and step out and go organic. It's usually not their fathers or their grandfathers.
One of the things I think this group has said that I don't always hear is that there's a real optimism that really and I think Judith, you mentioned it, if this 10-year plan were adopted, that we really, as a society, as a world society, could mitigate climate change.
It's true.
And that is what policy makers, Vermont's one thing, but nationwide really, of course, need to hear. And if you were to recommend to any of us something to read besides Judith's great books, which I would highly recommend, but an actual plan that covers, okay, the state of Vermont's one thing, but again, the worldwide plan, would it be the gentleman, the foreign minister, or the fellow from France? Is that the plan that people are trying to get people to subscribe to that actually could maybe have the biggest bang?
Rodale put out a white paper that's excellent. And you can just go online and look up Rodale. Rodale is the organic company in Pennsylvania that's been working on organics forever. And they did a wonderful thing. If you just typed in Rodale white paper, that's an excellent publication.
I guess another thing to note is that more and more organizations are forming that are about this, that are related, that are focused on soil and the soil-climate connection, and people are putting up more and more resource pages. So, I mean, this is what takes all my time every day, is trying to keep up with all of it. But, I mean, we could be in touch and we could recommend for your webpage or some resources. I mean, I'm just thinking, because you had asked a question about what could we do with our perennial gardens, and I just got the sense that maybe someone's thinking of doing more. Well, there's a really significant book, The Carbon Farming Solution, which brings in all different trees that provide this, and which, I mean, the author, Eric Tonsmeyer, is a permaculturist, and it gets very sophisticated. There's so many resources depending on what your interests are. Just thinking, when you mentioned the potential power of the garden clubs of America, I was thinking about a group of landscape gardeners in Southern California that began to become aware of the importance of the work that they do, that maybe when they began as landscape designers, their concerns were mostly aesthetic. But then their concerns became more about holding the water, keeping the water on the landscape, and then understanding the carbon connection. So they actually held a conference, and the group might be a good ally for you all. It's called the Green Gardens Group in Los Angeles, the G3 Network. And one person that I met there has a radio podcast series called Earth Friendly Gardens. And I know this because she interviewed me last week, but she has all kinds of people who are passionate about these connections, and this particular podcast series has a very practical bent. So I recommend that. Diane Downey, and she's British, and so you get to listen to her speaking with a beautiful accent when she asks questions.
Don't ever underestimate how you can make a difference. I mean, I'm always just blown away. If, you know, 1989, I think it was, I thought, what a good idea. Why don't we just put some farmers together with some chefs, and we'll invite the Garden Club of Manchester and you know, some land trust people. We'll have a little party and raise awareness that there's a bunch of good farmers out here. Holy mackerel, that thing took off like you wouldn't believe. And I think there's just things we can do. And you know, the same with Jesse. I don't know if I can invite you now that he's got a brand baby to go out and look at his farm, but maybe we could have a little tour, put together a little tour to go out and look, and he could explain, and you could see for yourselves the amazing improvement of his soils with the work that he's doing.
Great idea.
That would be a good thing to have a tour.
I think that'd be
Maybe good for next year.
But, but each thing that we do, I called up Judy after I read her book and found out that she lived in Bennington, and I said, I guess we need to talk. And she was the one who put me on to all these soil scientists, and I've just become a soil junkie since then, and I go around and talk to people about it, and you know, it makes a difference. And even if you just talk in your club or just
I think it's really interesting living in this small state because we can do things in this small
Yeah.
state. The Vermont Department of Agriculture hasn't always been as supportive as we'd like them to be, but they just this week, and I didn't get to it because I was up north, had a no-till conference at Dorset Peak Jerseys up in Danby
Oh, great.
for other farmers to come and see, you know. And kale is not organic, but he's doing no-till, and the soil is getting better and better and better all the time.
Excellent.
And so he was there to speak to other farmers and say, this is good.
Yeah. Franz von Schock down here in Pownell, he's doing no-till and holistic herd grazing on his farm on Mount Anthony Road, and I went over and toured that with him. And it's amazing how his farm looks. He's pushed back a lot of brush. The grasses are coming in. He's got one of those big machines. I'm not sure if he really needs it because he doesn't really need to plant a lot, but he's doing it and he's experimenting with it, and he also has some wonderful things to show that he's doing down there.
It sounds
Yeah.
so simple.
It is simple. That's the amazing thing. Putting sheep, you know, one thing is that we have wonderful tools now. We have that FlexiNet fencing and those solar chargers. So with about a $600 investment, you can be in the land regeneration business. Yeah.
And also I've noticed that people who have small-time farmers who have chickens, they have movable chicken coops.
That's right.
That are on wheels.
That's
and
right.
So, yeah.
And they're great. That's what Jesse moves his chickens on up at his place.
Yeah, so it fertilizes your property.
Absolutely.
And
And you know what? You don't have to go and clean up after the chickens.
That's right.
And I was talking to some dairy farmers last week who have a lot of young stock, and they were all in the barn. And then they had this land outside that was bare and was a wreck and could be good pasture. And I said, why don't you put those young stock to work? And just, you know, cows, they don't even need a FlexiNet, they just need a monofilament. You just put the stick in and put a little piece of electric fence along there. And those cows, those young stock, if he moved them, you know, every other day or whatever, they could probably reclaim that pasture in a month. And it is. It's amazingly simple. And then you wouldn't have to clean the barn. And you wouldn't have to spread the manure on the, you know, on the pasture. It's all done. That's right. That's right. I even talked to a dairy farmer, a grass farmer. I don't know if you've heard of Maple Hill Creamery. They have really great yogurt. And they're over in Sharon Springs, New York. And they're all grass-fed. They don't feed any grain. And they're an Allen Savory hub. They teach other people how to do this holistic herd management. And they don't feed the calves milk replacer. The cow has the calf. They keep the cow on the mother, the calf on the mother. The calf drinks a little bit of milk when it's young, and it'll drink more as it gets older. And so the mother's, what she can contribute to the milk yield drops off as the calf gets older, but they don't have to buy the milk replacer. They have much, much healthier calves, much, much happier mothers and happier calves, and the calves just go out with the mother to the fields, and they cycle their cows, they graze their cows 2 times in 2 different fields a day in between milkings. They come in and milk, and then they'll send it out to another pasture, and so they have all these paddocks around. But the calves are so happy, it's so natural. They're not milking, they're not mixing up that milk replacer and putting it in the buckets and getting the buckets to the calves and making sure the calves are getting the milk and all of that. You know, it saves a lot of time. So simple is what a
You
lot
probably
of it is.
know Rich Larson's farm up in Wells.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know,
Does he keep the calves on the mothers?
they're all grass-fed. His milk
Yeah.
now is all grass-fed. And he moves, I think he said he moves those cows as much as 5 times a day.
Yeah,
But he keeps them in a very small area and moves them. You know, he doesn't have a huge herd now,
Yeah.
so it's a pretty small herd.
But it
his
keeps
milk
the
is-
costs down, it keeps the milk healthier.
Yeah.
And
Keeps us healthier.
That's right.
Yeah, his milk is
And it's
incredible.
all related, that's the other thing we have to remember, you know, it's not just climate change, it's our health, the food health, that health will help alleviate poverty, more family farms could help alleviate poverty, could create jobs. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen if we really focused on healthy soils. Yeah.
Now, you're saying that mob grazing, when you move them frequently, you don't have problems with water runoff,
No.
taking it into the river system or the lake system?
No,
So
it goes into the
alleviate that
ground, it
problem.
does what the ground, what
Because
nature.
you're moving them.
Yeah, you're moving them, the urine, instead of, you know, being in a big barn and getting pushed into one of those big manure digesters and all that, the urine's going right into the ground. The roots are really healthy because you're not overgrazing, and so that root, like Judy said, 20,000 gallons per acre per 1% of carbon that you're putting in the soil. It's going to retain that much more water. And the same with the dry manure. I mean, you know, they leave the cow plots around, but then they move on, and, you know, that breaks up too. And then if you bring
Reduce the
chicken-
runoff into the lakes. Yeah.
The mob grazing probably would eliminate it.
It would eliminate it. That's why for our regenerative ag, our water quality bill, regenerative ag would be a really, really good idea. I mean, it's natural. It's the way nature designed it, and we just have chosen to ignore that for a long time.
But nature will reclaim itself.
Definitely will. Yeah.
Simple question, or maybe it's simple. I have a 13-acre cornfield in front of me that's on its cycle right now where it's resting and it's in alfalfa and other things. If I suggest to the farmer he bring over, if he's 15 miles away or 10 miles away, and he bring over manure and spray it on the land, does that do it for, in place of having
The animals?
The animals?
No.
The animals
No,
have to
it's
be there.
the animals have to be there because as they eat that grass, they stimulate it. And secondly, the action of their hoofs seems to be really part of the system. So they're trampling they're moving through, they're eating the tops, and then they're trampling the rest. And then the urine is also part of it because it's returning that water that they drink back into the
Natural tilling.
It's not really, yeah,
But it's
kind
their,
of tilling.
yeah, in their own way. Yeah.
But the state requires these farmers to rotate their crops, and then they get into, first it had to be 3 years of corn, then it was a year of alfalfa, and then they changed it, and they couldn't do that, and it seems to us that between the farmer and the state, there is so much controversy.
Well, there are a lot of rules and regulations.
And that they don't think what's is being required and is working, except costing them more money.
I think the state requirements, now I'm not sure about this, but I think they have to do with the amounts of fertilizers and amounts of, toxic chemicals.
So they have to test it and they have to put the
Yeah.
chemicals
Because they
on
don't
it.
have those requirements for organic farmers. They only have buffer requirements around, along rivers and that kind of thing. Do you know more about that, Brian?
Well, it continues to be, with the Clean Water Bill, we never got to the point where it was mandatory in terms of stopping phosphorus runoff. It continues to be a problem. And sadly, one of the things I've learned in the past couple of years on the Natural Resource and Energy Committee is we see ourselves as a green state in a lot of ways, but I'll tell you, we are not a green state in a lot of ways. One of it has to do, it's very sad actually. In clean water, the situation in Lake Champlain and other bodies of water are very good examples of that. We still have a ways to go. There's a little bit of an urban legend out there that Vermont is really taking the lead and really much cleaner with regard to water and soil than it actually is.
Well, and then the money for Lake Champlain was taken away from the fields. We kept getting promised certain things, and so that doesn't happen because they have to clean up Champlain, which I understand too, but it's,
I find the government is slightly broken.
The understatement.
Well, that's the other thing. I would also like to note that climate change is not a political problem. And
But it is a political problem.
Okay, and
Fascinating.
there are no more questions. We'll let Sally rest. And I want to also know that Liz Lupa has provided all sorts of goodies over the table, so please take some and enjoy them. She's a great cook. And I want to thank Mary and One World for letting us have this space this evening and providing TV taping organized completely by Mary and Michael. And I wanted to thank Sally and Judy Schwartz for filling us in on a lot of really great information which will make a change in what we're doing very shortly, because the fall is coming.
Great.
So if there's no more questions, we'll adjourn the meeting.